The morning Pearl Holloway was supposed to become the happiest woman in Caldwell, Kansas. She ended up being the saddest one instead, sitting alone on the church steps with rice still caught in her veil, and her whole future collapsed around her like a burning barn. It was the summer of 1882, and Caldwell had been growing fast, the way all cattle towns along the Kishom Trail grew in those years, rough at the edges, loud in the saloons, but trying with all its might to become something civilized, something worth staying in. The church on Meridian Street was the symbol of that effort. It had real glass windows, not just shuttered openings, and a proper bell that rang on Sunday mornings loud enough to shake the prairie dogs from their holes. The townspeople were proud of that church, and they had packed into it that Saturday morning in June with ribbons tied to the pews and fresh wildflowers in mason jars along every windowsill, because Pearl Holloway, daughter of the late Gerald Holloway, was finally getting married. Pearl was 24 years old, and she had the kind of face that stopped conversations, not because she was impossibly beautiful in some theatrical way, but because there was something genuine and warm in her dark eyes that made a person feel, somehow, that she was truly seeing them. Her hair was the color of autumn chestnuts, and she wore it pinned up under a veil her mother had saved for 20 years in a cedar chest. Her dress was ivory cotton with tiny pearl buttons running down the back, each one fastened that morning by the trembling hands of her best friend, Clara Withers, who had cried the whole time and called it joy. The groom was supposed to be Dale Fitch. Dale Fitch was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, and considered by most of Caldwell's female population to be the best catch in 3 counties. He owned the largest feed and grain store in town, had a good house with a proper parlor, and smiled with all his teeth when it suited him. Pearl had known him for 2 years. He had courted her with flowers and Sunday rides in his buggy, and when he proposed on the porch of her small boarding-house room on a warm April evening, she had said yes, because she had believed, truly believed, that he was a decent man who wanted to build something honest with her. She had been wrong about Dale Fitch in every way that mattered. The guests had been seated, the Reverend had taken his place, the organ had begun. Pearl had walked down that aisle on the arm of her uncle, Thomas Holloway, who smelled of bay rum and was trying not to limp from his bad knee, and she had felt the whole bright weight of the future pressing warmly against her chest. She had reached the altar. She had turned. She had looked at Dale. And Dale Fitch had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something trapped and cold. And he had said, quietly enough that only she and the Reverend could properly hear, that he was sorry, that he had made a mistake, that he couldn't go through with it, and that there was something she needed to know about him and Agnes Holcomb that he should have told her months ago. Agnes Holcomb, the widow who ran the millinery shop on 2nd Street. The Reverend had gone pale. Pearl had gone still as winter. And then the whispers had started moving through the pews like wind through dry grass, because people had seen what happened even if they hadn't heard the words, and in a town the size of Caldwell, a man walking away from the altar was a story that would be told for years. Dale had left. He had simply walked back down the aisle without looking at anyone, and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor had been the loudest thing Pearl had ever heard. The guests had sat frozen for a long, terrible moment, and then everyone had begun moving at once, talking in hushed, urgent voices, and Pearl's uncle had reached for her arm, and Clara had appeared from somewhere with her eyes wide and horrified, and somehow Pearl could never quite piece together how. She had ended up outside, sitting on the front steps of the church in her ivory dress, her veil slightly askew, and completely, utterly alone. The guests filtered out eventually, most of them too uncomfortable to know what to say to her, offering brief awkward pats on the shoulder or murmured condolences that sounded like they were meant for a funeral, which Pearl supposed was not entirely inaccurate. Clara stayed for a while, holding her hand and saying fierce, loyal things about Dale Fitch's character that would have made the Reverend faint. But Pearl's uncle had needed to attend to the canceled reception arrangements, and Clara had a young baby at home who couldn't be left indefinitely. And eventually Pearl had told her, quietly and firmly, to go, that she needed a moment alone. What she had meant was a minute. What she got was longer than that. The street in front of the church emptied gradually. The noon sun climbed to its highest point and beat down on the dust without mercy. Pearl sat on those steps and stared at her own hands, at the white cotton gloves she had saved for months to buy, and she thought about all the things she had believed that had turned out not to be true. She had believed that Dale was honest. She had believed that she had chosen well. She had believed, in the quiet way that women of her time and place had to believe in order to survive, that the future would be kinder than the past had been. Her father had died of a lung sickness when she was 17. Her mother had followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and hard winters. Pearl had come to Caldwell from Wichita with very little except a strong back, a careful mind, and the ability to take in fine sewing, which she did for the wives of cattlemen and merchants and anyone else who needed a hem turned or a dress fitted. She had built herself a small, careful life, and she had truly thought, that Dale Fitch was going to be the next good thing. Instead, she was sitting on the church steps in the middle of the day in her wedding dress, and she could feel the town watching her from behind curtains, and the humiliation of it was so complete and so physical that it sat in her chest like a stone. That was when she heard footsteps on the wooden boards beside the church, measured, unhurried footsteps, and then a figure came around the corner and stopped at the base of the steps, looking up at her. Raymond Norris was the sheriff of Caldwell, and he had held that position for 3 years, which in a cattle town along the Kisham Trail was long enough to qualify as practically ancient. He was 31 years old, lean but solid in the way of men who worked hard outdoors, with dark hair that had started going silver at the temples earlier than he would have preferred, and a face that was weathered and quiet, the kind of face that didn't give much away unless you looked at his eyes, which were a steady pale gray and tended to see more than people expected. He wore his badge on his vest as he always did, and his hat was pulled down against the sun, and he had come around the corner of the church because he had been doing his midday rounds and had noticed, from across the street, that there was still someone sitting on those steps long after everyone else had gone. He had heard what happened. Everyone in Caldwell had heard what happened within approximately 12 minutes of it occurring. He had been at the edge of the crowd earlier, not inside. He wasn't the church-going sort, though he respected those who were. And he had seen Dale Fitch come out of that building alone, and he had known immediately that something had gone badly wrong, and he had felt, in the quiet, deep place where he kept his opinions about people, a sharp and immediate dislike for Dale Fitch that went beyond the professional. He stood at the base of the steps and looked up at Pearl Holloway, who was staring at her gloved hands and had not yet noticed him, and he made a decision that was, for Raymond Norris, somewhat out of character. He sat down. Not beside her, not immediately. He sat on the bottom step, a respectful 2 steps below where she was, and he set his hat on his knee and he said nothing. He simply sat there in the sun, looking out at the empty street. Pearl heard him arrive. She heard him sit. She did not look up for a long moment, because she suspected whoever it was would say something well-meaning and awful, and she was not sure she could bear any more of that. But the silence stretched on, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was strangely the most peaceful thing she had encountered in the last 2 hours, and finally she looked sideways and down. She recognized Raymond Norris immediately. Everyone in Caldwell knew the sheriff by sight, though Pearl had never spoken to him directly. He was looking out at the street with his hat on his knee, and there was nothing in his expression that resembled pity, which was the first relief she had felt all morning. "Sheriff Norris," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected, though slightly rough at the edges. "Miss Holloway," he said, without turning to look at her. She waited for him to say something else. He didn't. "Are you here in an official capacity?" she asked, because it was the only thing she could think to say. He considered this for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm just sitting." Pearl looked at him for another moment, and then she looked back at the street, and something in her chest, which had been clenched tight as a fist since the moment Dale had walked away, loosened very slightly. "I must look ridiculous," she said. "You don't," he said. He said it simply as a fact without embellishment. "I'm sitting on a church step in a wedding dress," she said. "That is, by most definitions, ridiculous." "The dress is pretty," he said. "And you look like a woman who's had a hard morning and is entitled to sit wherever she pleases." Pearl was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He was with Agnes Holcomb." Raymond nodded once slowly. "I know," he said. "How long have you known?" He was quiet just a beat too long before he answered, and she caught it. "Sheriff Norris," she said, and there was something sharp and clear in her voice now, not angry exactly, but precise. "How long have you known?" He turned and looked at her then directly for the first time, and the gray eyes were steady and honest and faintly regretful. "3 weeks," he said. "Heard it from a reliable source. I didn't have any legal grounds to. It's not a crime what he was doing. And it wasn't my business to." He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I should have told you. I didn't know how. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." Pearl studied him. She found to her genuine surprise that she was not furious at him. She thought perhaps she should be. But there was something in the plainness of his admission, the lack of hedging in it, that was oddly more comforting than infuriating. "No," she said after a long moment. "It wasn't your business to. He was the one who should have told me." She paused, "though I wouldn't have minded the warning." "No," he agreed quietly. "I expect you wouldn't have." They sat in silence again. Down the street 2 horses were tied outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, switching their tails at flies. A wagon rolled slowly past, the driver pointedly not looking at the church steps, which meant he was absolutely looking at them. "The whole town is watching," Pearl said. "Yes," Raymond said. "They'll talk for a while, then something else will happen and they'll talk about that. Small comfort." "It's the only kind available at the moment," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, dry and honest, that almost made her want to smile, which was a feeling she had not expected to encounter today. "What are you doing out here, really?" she asked him. "You don't need to sit with me. I'm not going to do anything dramatic." "I know you're not," he said. "You seem like a practical woman." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a careful deliberateness that suggested he had thought about the words, "Nobody ought to have to sit alone after a morning like that." Pearl looked at him for a long time. He had turned back to look at the street again, his hat balanced on his knee, his profile quiet and settled as a rock in a riverbed. She thought about the 3 weeks. She thought about Dale, and Agnes Holcomb's millinery shop, and the pearl buttons on the back of her dress that Clara had fastened with such hope this morning. She felt, very suddenly and unexpectedly, the tears come. Not the dramatic, gasping kind. Pearl Holloway was not given to that, but the slow, quiet kind, the kind that came when the numbness finally wore through and the reality beneath it made itself known. They slid down her cheeks without her permission, and she sat very straight and let them fall and did not make a sound. Raymond did not look at her when she cried. He did not offer a handkerchief, though she suspected he had one. He did not say anything comforting or trite. He simply sat there on the step below her, solid and unhurried, like a man who had decided he was going to be present and had meant it. After a while, the tears stopped on their own. Pearl straightened her veil, which had been listing to the left since the church, and smoothed her skirts and exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said. "I need to go change out of this dress," she said, and stood up. She was taller than she had felt all morning, which was strange but not unpleasant. Raymond stood too, settling his hat back on his head. He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light fell across his face at an angle that showed the fine lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples, and Pearl thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that it was a very honest face. "Miss Holloway," he said, "for what it's worth, Dale Fitch is a fool." "He is," she agreed. She pulled off one of her white cotton gloves, then the other, because she had decided she was done with them. She folded them in her hands. Then she said, "Sheriff Norris, would you like to have dinner sometime? Not like that, or perhaps like that. I don't know yet. I just think I'd like to have a conversation with someone who tells me the truth." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in those gray eyes, something that was not quite a smile but was its close relative. "Yes," he said. "I think I would." "Good," she said. And she walked down the steps and along the dusty street toward her boarding house, her ivory skirts trailing a little in the dirt, and she did not look back, though she knew he watched her go. The dinner happened 4 days later, at the town's only proper restaurant, a narrow establishment called the Prairie Table, run by a Swedish woman named Ingrid Larsson, who kept her place meticulously clean and served the best beef stew in the territory. Pearl had traded her wedding dress back to the dressmaker for credit and used part of it to buy a new blue calico dress that fit her better anyway. She had not spoken to Dale Fitch, who had apparently left town for a week, and she had avoided Agnes Holcomb's millinery shop with a thoroughness that the entire town understood and respected. She arrived at the Prairie Table before Raymond did, because she was punctual, and she suspected, correctly, that being a working sheriff meant schedules were not always predictable. She sat at the table Ingrid showed her to, ordered coffee, and occupied herself with looking at the menu, which she had read many times before but which gave her something to do with her eyes. Raymond arrived 7 minutes later, hat in hand, with a small smudge of dust on his sleeve that he hadn't noticed, and when he saw her sitting at the table he stopped in the doorway for just a fraction of a second, the way people do when they see someone in a new context and their brain has to reorganize what it already knew. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from her. "Sorry," he said. "We had a situation with some trail hands." "The kind that required the sheriff?" she asked. "The kind that required the sheriff to explain patiently that the silver dollar closes at midnight, and that is not a suggestion," he said. Pearl smiled. It was the first real, unguarded smile she had managed in 4 days, and it felt strange on her face, like a muscle she had forgotten to use. They ordered beef stew. They talked. Pearl had not expected to find Raymond Norris easy to talk to. He had struck her on the church steps as a man of very few words, and she had been prepared for dinner to be a series of long pauses punctuated by brief exchanges. But she discovered over the course of that first meal that Raymond was not so much a man of few words as a man who chose his words carefully, and once he was in a context that felt honest, which this apparently did, the words came readily enough. He told her he had grown up in Missouri, near a small town outside of Springfield. His father had been a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher who had died when he was 12. He had come west at 21, worked as a deputy in Wichita for 4 years under a more experienced sheriff, and come to Caldwell when the position opened. He had no family here except a younger brother in Missouri who wrote letters twice a year. Pearl told him about Wichita, about her parents, about the sewing work that had kept her going. She was straightforward about the facts of her life and did not dress them up because she had always found pretense exhausting, and she suspected that Raymond was the kind of man who would notice pretense anyway. "What made you want to stay in Caldwell?" she asked him. He thought about it. "It's a good town trying to be better," he said. "That's worth working for." "That's a generous view for a town that has 3 saloons and a fairly regular shootout," she said. "2 saloons," he said. "The Diamond burned down last spring, and the shootouts have become infrequent." "A mark of progress," she said. "I take it where I can find it," he said, and the way he said it with that same dry, honest ease made her laugh, and the laugh came out of her before she could moderate it, clear and genuine and slightly surprised. He looked at her when she laughed, and something in his expression changed, became more alive, as though the laugh had shifted something inside the room. They stayed at the Prairie Table until Ingrid began giving them pointed looks and moving chairs, which in Caldwell was the accepted signal that the establishment was closing. They walked outside into the warm June evening, and the street smelled of dust and horse and the faint sweetness of something blooming in somebody's window box, and they stood on the boardwalk for a moment, not quite ready to part. "This was good," Pearl said. "It was," he said. "I'd like to do it again," she said, because she had decided in the last few months of her life that life was too short to be coy about things that mattered. Raymond looked at her in the lamplight from the restaurant window, and the gray eyes were warm in a way that was new, or perhaps just visible for the first time. "So would I," he said. She walked home alone because it was a small town and the boarding house was 3 blocks away and she had walked it 1,000 times. But she was aware, the whole way, of a feeling in her chest that was tentative and cautious and also, underneath all of that, quite bright. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. On Tuesday evenings, Raymond would come by the boarding house and they would walk, if the weather permitted, along the main street, or out toward the edge of town where the prairie opened up, and you could see the sky going on forever, which was one of the things Pearl had come to love about this part of Kansas, the sky. It was enormous out there, bigger than anything she had known in Wichita, and it changed constantly, stacking clouds in ways that were almost theatrical. On some Saturdays, when Raymond wasn't occupied with the demands of the town, he would come to the small room Pearl had set up as a sewing space in the back of the boarding house, and he would sit in the extra chair and they would talk while she worked. He had learned very quickly not to try to help with the sewing, after one unfortunate incident involving a bobbin that she would bring up periodically for the rest of her life, to his great discomfort. Clara Withers, Pearl's best friend, declared Raymond to be solid after meeting him the second time, which was Clara's highest form of praise. Clara's husband, Tom, was more cautious because Tom Withers was cautious about everything, but even he admitted after an afternoon spent in Raymond's company that the man seemed decent. "He doesn't say much," Tom said. "He says the right things," Pearl told him. "That's rarer," Tom conceded. The town watched. Caldwell was a town that paid attention to its inhabitants the way a small family pays attention to each other, with varying degrees of kindness and a complete lack of privacy. People noted that the sheriff was calling on Pearl Holloway, and the prevailing opinion, delivered at the dry goods store and in the saloon and over back fences, was that this was a more suitable arrangement than the previous one, since everyone had thought well of Pearl, and no one was feeling particularly charitable toward Dale Fitch. Dale Fitch had returned to town after his week away. He had not spoken to Pearl, and she had not sought him out. She saw him twice on the street, and both times she lifted her chin and kept walking, and both times she could feel the specific effort it cost her, which decreased a little each time. Agnes Holcomb had closed her millinery shop without explanation and moved to Wichita, which Caldwell took to mean that the arrangement between Agnes and Dale had not survived the exposure any better than Pearl's engagement had. Pearl felt, about that, something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. She was working on not feeling it, because she was trying to be the kind of woman who didn't take pleasure in other people's failures. But she was also being honest with herself about the fact that she was not perfect, and some things took time. It was in the 6th week of their Tuesday evenings and Saturday conversations that something shifted, the way things shift between people when the careful, respectful distance that propriety demands begins to feel less like courtesy and more like an obstacle. They had walked out to the edge of town, to the spot where there was a low bluff overlooking the creek that ran behind the south fields, and they had sat on the grass in the long summer light watching the water run. Pearl had brought a shawl because the evenings were cooling, and Raymond had his jacket on. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone else," Pearl said, because she had been thinking lately that they had covered the available ground of regular conversation and she wanted to go somewhere more honest. Raymond was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I almost left Caldwell 8 months ago." "Where were you going?" "Colorado, maybe. I had an offer to join a freight operation out of Pueblo." He paused. "It would have been good money." "What made you stay?" He was quiet again. "I'm not entirely sure," he said. "Something told me I wasn't supposed to leave yet." He said it plainly, without any mysticism in it, just as a fact he was reporting. I don't put much stock in things like that usually, but it was persistent. Pearl looked at him. The light was going golden, the way Kansas light did in late summer evenings, and it caught the silver in his hair and made his eyes look more green than gray. "I'm glad," she said quietly. He looked at her, and the look held for longer than was strictly conversational, and Pearl was suddenly, acutely aware of how close they were sitting, and the warmth of the evening and the sound of the creek below. "Pearl," he said, and the use of her first name, which he had not done before, settled something in her chest like a key turning in a lock. "Yes," she said, not as an answer to a question, but as a general statement of agreement with whatever he was about to say. And Raymond Norris, who was a man of careful words and measured actions, reached over and took her hand in his and held it. And that was enough, that was more than enough, and they sat there in the long Kansas evening while the light went golden, and then amber, and then finally the deep blue of late dusk, and neither of them said much else because they didn't need to. Walking back to town, he kept her hand in his, and Pearl was aware of people seeing them, because of course people saw them. It was Caldwell and it was not yet dark, and she found, quite genuinely, that she did not mind at all. The trouble, when it came, arrived in the form of a man named Eli Cutter. Eli Cutter was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was not some darkness that descended on Caldwell with malicious intent toward Pearl specifically. He was simply the kind of man who accumulated problems the way some clothes accumulate lint, steadily, comprehensively, and in ways that eventually became everyone's concern. Eli rode into Caldwell in late August with 4 companions, all of them trail hands who had recently finished a drive and had money to spend. The first 2 days of this were unremarkable. Trail hands with money appeared in Caldwell regularly, and as long as they kept their arguments inside the saloon and didn't disturb the general peace of the town, Raymond Norris allowed them their celebration and kept a watching eye. The problem was Eli Cutter's relationship with whiskey, which was passionate and entirely negative in its effects. Sober, Eli was a plain, ordinary man in his late 20s with no particular distinction. Drunk, which he became rapidly and remained for extended periods, he was loud, grandiose, and prone to making statements that required official response. The first official response came on his 3rd evening in town, when he and one of his companions got into a dispute at the Silver Dollar that escalated past words. Raymond arrived, separated them, and made clear that this was the boundary. Eli Cutter accepted this with the specific sullenness of a man who knows he's wrong but resents being told so, and for 2 days things were quiet. The second and more significant incident happened on a Thursday morning when Pearl was walking back from the dry goods store carrying a basket of thread and a length of muslin, and Eli Cutter was standing outside the Silver Dollar in a state that suggested he had never actually gone to bed. He said something to her as she passed. Pearl did not stop walking, because she was a woman who had learned in the course of her adult life that stopping frequently made things worse. She kept her pace even and did not look at him. He said it louder and moved to block the boardwalk. She stopped then because there was no choice, and she said, with a precision and coldness that would have frozen water, "Move out of my way, please." Eli did not move out of her way. He smiled in the way that drunk men with poor judgment sometimes smile, and said several things that Pearl would later decline to repeat in detail, the substance of which was that he had heard about the wedding business and had conclusions about her character that were entirely false and deeply offensive. What happened next happened quickly. Raymond came off the opposite boardwalk at a pace that was faster than his usual measured walk, but was not quite running, because Raymond Norris did not run in a way that suggested panic. He crossed the street and stepped between Pearl and Eli Cutter and said, in a voice that was quiet and very specific in its qualities, something to Eli that Pearl didn't fully hear, but that had an immediate and profound effect on Eli's willingness to continue the conversation. Eli Cutter and his companions were invited to leave Caldwell that morning. They did. Raymond came back to Pearl, who was standing on the boardwalk with her basket of thread and her spine very straight. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then after a pause, "Thank you. I should have moved him along 2 days ago," Raymond said, and there was a tightness in his jaw that she recognized as the specific expression he wore when he was blaming himself for something. "You couldn't have predicted," she started. "I should have moved him along 2 days ago," he said again quietly, and she understood that he was going to sit with this responsibility for a while, and there was no point arguing about it right now. "Come to dinner tonight," she said instead. "I'm cooking. Mrs. Hanford is letting me use the kitchen." He looked at her and some of the tightness in his jaw eased. "Yes," he said. "All right." She cooked him a proper supper in Mrs. Hanford's boarding house kitchen, roast chicken with potatoes, and a dried apple pie that she was particularly proud of. And they sat at the small table in the kitchen, while the evening came in through the window screen, and Raymond ate with the genuine appreciation of a man who usually fed himself from the restaurant or whoever happened to bring something by the jail. "This is the best meal I've had in longer than I want to admit," he said. "That is either a compliment to me or a commentary on your habits," she said. "Both," he said. "Honestly, both." She laughed, and he smiled across the table at her, and the warmth of the kitchen and the lamplight and the smell of the pie cooling on the windowsill made the whole thing feel like something that was already home, which was a thought that Pearl tucked away carefully to examine later. It was over that pie which was, she maintained, the real catalyst of the evening, that things became more honest between them. "I want to ask you something," Raymond said, and the care in his voice signaled that what was coming mattered. "Then ask it," she said. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what you expected or what you thought you were supposed to want. What do you actually want?" Pearl looked at him across the table. She had thought about this question, in various forms, in the months since the church steps. She had turned it over carefully because she understood that the failure of her engagement to Dale Fitch was, in one important way, partly her own failure, not her fault, because fault lay squarely with Dale, but her failure to be honest with herself about what she had actually needed versus what she had talked herself into accepting. "I want to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I've thought about leaving, but I don't think running from humiliation is the same as actually solving it. I want to have enough sewing work to be comfortable. I want to have real conversations with someone who doesn't perform honesty but actually practices it." She paused. "And I would like to have a family, someday, when the time and person are right." She said this last part steadily and without apology, because she was 24 years old and she was done with being coy about things she genuinely wanted. Raymond was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I want to be the person you have those conversations with." He said it simply, the way he said most things, without any decoration. "I've been sitting with that for a while." Pearl looked at him, at the honest, quiet face across the table, at the gray eyes that had been seeing her clearly from the first day on the church steps, and she thought that here was a man who had sat down beside her at her worst moment not because it was his job but because he had decided that someone should, and who had been telling her the truth in one form or another ever since, and who had never once made her feel like the abandoned bride, only like Pearl. "Raymond," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said. "I thought you should know." The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long, which she would have found unbearable if not for the fact that in those 3 seconds, something happened to his face that she had not seen before. Something opened, something that had been held carefully closed came undone, and then he said, "I know I'm in love with you. I've known it for a while. I didn't want to say it before you were ready to hear it." Pearl considered this. "You were waiting for me." "Yes," he said. "That's," she said, and stopped and started again. "That is a very good thing you did." He reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his. And they sat that way in the lamplight of the boarding house kitchen until the pie was entirely eaten and the fire in the stove had burned low, and everything that had been tentative between them settled into something sure. September in Caldwell smelled of cattle and dust and the distant sweetness of harvested hay, and Pearl moved through it feeling as though the world had been rearranged in a configuration that made more sense than the previous one. Raymond called on her properly and officially, which in 1882 in Kansas meant he spoke to Mrs. Hanford, who was Pearl's effective guardian by proximity, and made his intentions clear. Mrs. Hanford, who was a small, ferocious woman of 60 who had opinions about everything and shared them at will, told him she thought Pearl had the sense God gave a sensible creature and could make her own decisions, but that she was glad he'd had the decency to say it directly. Raymond thanked her solemnly. Mrs. Hanford offered him coffee, which was, in her particular hierarchy of approval, a significant gesture. Clara Withers was delighted. She came by the sewing room one afternoon when she knew Pearl would be working and sat across from her and said without preamble, "So it's serious." "It's serious," Pearl agreed without looking up from the hem she was turning. "He's a good man," Clara said. "Genuinely, Tom says so, and Tom doesn't say things like that about anyone." "I know he is," Pearl said, and the simplicity in her voice, no hedging, no qualification, made Clara smile. "You deserve it," Clara said. "After the business with Dale." "Dale feels very far away now," Pearl said, and realized as she said it that it was true. What had happened in June had been terrible, but it had also, somehow, become the hinge on which everything else had turned, and she couldn't quite bring herself to wish it away when the thing that had come from it was sitting across from her most evenings with that quiet, honest face. October arrived with a sharpness in the air that meant winter was taking its time coming, but had sent the scout ahead. Pearl had more sewing work than ever. The cattle season was ending, and the wives of the wealthier merchants were thinking about new things for the colder months, and Pearl had taken on 2 apprentice girls from the edge of town who needed the work and were quick learners. She was building something real, and she knew it, and the knowledge had a specific weight that was entirely pleasant. One afternoon in mid-October, Raymond came to the sewing room with his hat in his hands, not the usual relaxed posture, but the careful posture, the one she had learned to recognize as meaning he was about to say something that mattered. She set down her work. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He turned his hat in his hands for a moment, which was the closest she had ever seen him come to fidgeting. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I want to do it right, though, and I need to know, after what happened in June, if this is something you're willing to consider." "Not assume, consider." Pearl looked at him. "Raymond," she said. "Yes. You are the most careful man I have ever met," she said with great warmth in her voice. "It's a compliment," she said. "An enormous one." He looked at her, and the careful expression shifted into something more open. "Ask me," she said. He reached into his pocket and brought out a ring. It was a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, deep red as autumn, and it was not extravagant, but it was exactly right, exactly the kind of thing that suited Pearl, who had never wanted extravagance and had always wanted truth. "Pearl Holloway," he said. "I would very much like to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, and at his hand holding it, steady and sure, and at the gray eyes above it, which were watching her with the particular intensity of a man whose whole heart is in the balance. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Raymond, I will." He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it there, the garnet glowing in the afternoon light from the window, and felt something so complete and settled in her chest that it was almost startling. "When," she said. "When you want," he said. "When you're ready." "Spring," she said. "I'd like a spring wedding, and I'd like it to be small." "Small is fine," he said. "And I'd like it to be in the church," she said. "I'm not going to let what happened in June take that from me." Something moved through his eyes, respect and love, and the specific admiration of a man who is watching someone reclaim their own territory. "Good," he said. "I think that's exactly right." They told Clara first, who cried and then apologized for crying, and then said she was absolutely not sorry, and hugged Pearl hard enough to require some adjustment of the garnet ring afterward. They told Mrs. Hanford, who said she had expected as much, and that she would need Raymond's coffee preference if he was going to be around more regularly. They told Thomas Holloway, Pearl's uncle, who had come to Caldwell for a brief visit, and who shook Raymond's hand with a firmness that was probably a little about making sure Raymond understood what he was taking on and mostly about genuine gladness. The town received the news with the same complete and immediate awareness with which it received all news, and the general opinion was, as expressed by various members of the community to various other members, that this was a sensible and appropriate development, and that it was good to see Pearl Holloway smiling the way she was smiling. Dale Fitch, when he heard, because Caldwell said nothing publicly, and Pearl gave him credit for that. She had made her peace with Dale in the private way. You make peace with people who have hurt you when you understand that continuing to carry the wound requires more energy than setting it down. She didn't forgive him entirely, but she had stopped letting it take up space in her daily life, and that was enough. The winter was cold and clean and companionable. Raymond and Pearl had dinner together most evenings, either at the prairie table or in Mrs. Hanford's kitchen, and on Sundays she had started going to church, which she had let lapse in the years since her parents died, and Raymond, who was not, as established, a church-going man, started coming with her, which was noticed and appreciated by the Reverend, who shook Raymond's hand afterward with particular warmth and told him the congregation was glad to see him. Raymond, for his part, was discovering what it meant to have a place to come back to. He had been a solitary person for most of his adult life, not from preference but from circumstance. There had never been anyone who made him want to change that. Now there was Pearl, with her dark eyes and her practical mind and her laugh that came out whole and genuine when something actually struck her as funny, and her willingness to say difficult things plainly and her absolute refusal to accept anything less than honesty. And he found that solitude, once something he had considered a natural condition, now felt simply like absence. He wrote to his brother in Missouri, James, who was 28 and still working their father's old farm, and told him about Pearl. James wrote back with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for this news for years and was enormously pleased by it, and said he would come for the wedding if the roads were passable, which in Missouri in May was a reasonable conditional promise. May arrived in Caldwell with warmth and the specific green light of prairie spring, when the grass came up so fast and so vivid it looked almost unreal against the wide sky. Pearl's apprentice girls had helped her make her own dress this time, a softer ivory than the one in June, with no elaborate details, just good fabric cut well, because Pearl had decided that this wedding was going to be about what was real rather than what was impressive. The church on Meridian Street had glass windows, and the morning light through them on Pearl's second walk down that aisle was something that Clara, who cried again, would describe for years as the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. James Norris had come from Missouri, true to his word, a stocky, cheerful man with none of Raymond's quietness and all of the family's tendency toward gray eyes. He had grabbed Pearl's hands when they met and said, "He's been waiting his whole life for someone like you and not knowing it," which made Raymond say his name in a warning tone and made Pearl laugh out loud. The Reverend performed the ceremony with a warmth that was genuine and slightly personal. He had his own complicated feelings about weddings at that particular church after the events of June, and this was his redemption story too. Pearl said her vows steadily and clearly, looking Raymond in the eyes the whole time. Raymond said his quietly and with a certainty that was absolute, in the way that only people who have thought very carefully about the words they are saying can be certain. When he put the ring on her finger, the same garnet ring, which fit her as though it had always been hers, she felt the weight of it as something entirely new from what she had felt that morning in June when Dale Fitch had stood at that altar. That morning she had felt like someone walking toward a picture of a future. This morning she felt like someone arriving somewhere real. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said. Raymond kissed her, brief and genuine, with his hand cupped against her cheek, and the congregation, the small congregation, because they had meant small, made the sound that small congregations make when something is exactly right. They walked out of the church together into the May sunlight, and Pearl turned her face up to it, and Raymond kept his hand in hers, and behind them the bell rang, and the sound of it went out over Caldwell and the surrounding prairie like an announcement. They moved into the house on Walnut Street that Raymond had been renting for 3 years. It was not large, but it had a proper parlor and a kitchen with good light from the east window, which Pearl immediately recognized as ideal for fine sewing work. She set up her sewing space in the front room, hung curtains in the bedroom windows, and put a geranium on the kitchen windowsill that Mrs. Hanford gave her as a wedding gift, along with a recipe for apple cake, and the information that Raymond preferred his coffee with 2 spoons of sugar, which Pearl had already known. The first months of their marriage had the particular quality of people discovering what they are like together in daily life, which is different in texture and detail from what courtship reveals. They discovered that Raymond woke very early and quietly, and that Pearl was not a morning person, and that this arrangement suited them both. They discovered that she had strong opinions about how the kitchen should be organized, and that he had mild but persistent opinions about where things should be hung on the walls, and they negotiated these things with the good humor that comes from genuine respect and genuine amusement. They discovered that they were very good at being in the same room quietly, which was one of the better tests of compatibility. The ability to be comfortable in a shared silence, each occupied with their own work, without the silence becoming a problem to be solved. Raymond discovered that Pearl sang while she worked, under her breath, half-consciously, old songs mostly, things her mother had sung. He never mentioned it to her because he thought she might stop if she knew he noticed, and he didn't want her to stop. Pearl discovered that Raymond kept a journal, a small leather-bound book that he wrote in most evenings. She didn't ask to read it, and he didn't offer, and they both understood that this was a private thing that she would respect, and that this understanding between them was itself a form of intimacy. The summer of 1883 brought heat, and a good cattle season, and 2 new businesses opening on Main Street, which Raymond took as evidence that his assessment of Caldwell as a good town trying to be better was on track. Pearl's sewing work had grown to the point where she was considering whether she could afford a proper shop space, a question that she and Raymond discussed in careful detail over several evenings, going over the numbers with a thoroughness that reflected their shared practical nature. "You should do it," Raymond said. "It's a risk," Pearl said. "You're good at what you do," he said. "Everyone in town knows it. The risk is manageable." "You're biased," she said. "I'm accurate," he said. "Those are different things." She leased a small space on 2nd Street, not far from where Agnes Holcomb's millinery shop had been, which Pearl privately considered poetic, and opened Pearl Norris Fine Sewing. The sign was painted by Tom Withers, who turned out to have a hidden talent for lettering, and Clara organized a small, informal celebration that involved approximately half the women in Caldwell coming by with small gifts and leaving with the intention of commissioning new work. Clara's husband Tom told Raymond at the Silver Dollar one evening over the single glass of beer that was Tom's usual allowance, "I thought you might know this already, but you have an exceptional wife." "I know it," Raymond said. "She's changed things for Clara too," Tom said. "Having a friend like that, someone who says what she means." "She's good at that," Raymond said. "You're good for each other," Tom said. "I wanted to say it plainly." Raymond looked at him. "Thank you, Tom," he said, and meant it entirely. The autumn of 1883 brought a development that changed the comfortable shape of their mornings. Pearl came into the kitchen on a Tuesday in October and stood in the doorway for a moment before Raymond, who was having his early coffee, noticed her. When he looked at her, he saw something in her face, not distress, but a held breath, a careful containment of something large. "I think we're going to have a child," she said. Raymond set down his coffee cup. He looked at her, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling on something that was warm and a little stunned and entirely good. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her steadily. "Are you well?" he said, because that was the thing he needed to know first. "I'm well," she said, "tired, a little queasy in the mornings, but well." "Pearl," he said. "I know," she said. He held her then in the kitchen in the early morning light, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, steady and strong as everything about him, and she closed her eyes and let herself be held, which was something she was still learning how to do without reservation. "A spring baby," she said after a while. "We'll need another room," he said. "We can expand the back of the house," she said. "I've been looking at it." "Of course you have," he said, and she could feel him smiling above her head. James Norris received the letter in Missouri and wrote back immediately that he was going to be the best uncle in the territory, and that Raymond had better name the baby James if it was a boy, to which Raymond wrote back that he would keep it in mind, which James correctly interpreted as a polite no. The winter of 1883 was Pearl's pregnancy winter, and she managed it with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything, continuing to work in the shop until February, when the cold and the bulk of the pregnancy made the walk less reasonable, at which point she moved her work home and continued from the front room. Raymond was attentive without being suffocating. He made sure she had what she needed, asked after her comfort without making her feel fragile, and learned to prepare breakfast tolerably well, which was a greater skill development than it might appear because Raymond's relationship with cooking had been purely functional before marriage. The baby came in April, when the prairie was green and the air smelled of new things. It was a boy, born in the house on Walnut Street with the help of the town doctor and Clara Withers, who held Pearl's hand and said fierce, loyal things throughout, as she had always done in Pearl's most significant moments. They named him William, after Pearl's father, Gerald William Holloway, taking the middle name as a quiet tribute that felt right to both of them. William Norris arrived in the world with a remarkable set of lungs and Raymond's gray eyes and Pearl's autumn chestnut hair, a combination that made Clara declare him immediately perfect and made Raymond stand beside the cradle for approximately 45 minutes straight on the first night, watching the baby sleep with an expression that he would have been embarrassed to know was entirely visible. Pearl, lying in bed and watching Raymond watch the baby, thought she had never loved anyone as clearly and completely as she loved this quiet man who had sat down beside her on church steps 2 years ago and offered her the plain good gift of his presence. "Come to bed," she said gently. "In a minute," he said. "He's going to be there in the morning," she said. "I know," Raymond said without moving. She smiled in the dark room and pulled the blanket up and listened to the spring wind outside the window and let him stand there as long as he needed to. William was a healthy, vocal, thoroughly engaging infant who rapidly became the subject of extensive commentary from Mrs. Hanford, Clara, and various other women of Caldwell who stopped by the shop and the house with the regularity that characterized genuine community warmth. Raymond carried the baby through town on his rounds with a naturalness that surprised even himself, tucking the child against his shoulder while he talked to merchants or checked that the saloons were behaving, a combination of duties that the town found both endearing and faintly comic. Tom Withers told Raymond he had never seen a sheriff look quite so domestic while simultaneously maintaining authority, and Raymond told him that domestic authority was possibly the most important kind. Pearl returned to the shop in June with William in a small cradle in the back room, and the business of her days settled into a pattern that was full and sometimes exhausting, and entirely of her own making, which was the thing she valued most about it. The years turned in Caldwell with the particular combination of change and consistency that characterized frontier towns in the 1880s. The cattle drives along the Kisham Trail were slowing. The railroads were changing everything, as they always did, routing stock in ways that bypassed the old trail towns, and Caldwell was feeling this shift. Raymond watched the economic changes with his usual careful attention and began, in consultation with the town council, to advocate for development that would sustain Caldwell beyond the cattle season, more permanent farming, merchant trade, a school expansion that would attract the kind of families who planned to stay. It was work that was less dramatic than managing trail hands and less visible than keeping the peace in a saloon town, but it was, Raymond believed, more important in the long run, and he was a man who thought in long runs. Pearl's shop continued to grow. She had 2 full employees now, not just apprentices, and had begun taking orders from as far as Wichita, where her reputation had traveled through the network of women who talked to each other across long distances about who did good work. She was building something that was entirely hers, that she had built herself, and the knowledge of it was a sustained, quiet pride that sat comfortably alongside her love for Raymond and William and the life on Walnut Street. William was 2 years old and walking with the confident instability of toddlers when Pearl first realized she was pregnant again. She told Raymond in the kitchen again in the morning again, and his response was the same as the first time, sitting down his coffee, crossing the room, checking first that she was well, and then holding her in the early light. "Are you happy?" she asked against his shoulder. "Entirely," he said. "You?" "Yes," she said. "Entirely." Their second child was a girl, born in the winter of 1886, and they named her Eleanor Margaret Eleanor for the sound of it, which Pearl had always loved, and Margaret for Raymond's mother, the schoolteacher from Missouri who had died when he was 12 and whom he had always wanted to honor somehow. Eleanor arrived with Pearl's dark eyes and a disposition from the very first days that was remarkably calm, which proved something of a contrast to William, who had never been calm about anything in his short life. Raymond said it was balance. Pearl said it was the specific mercy of the universe compensating for William's energy levels. Both of them were correct. The house on Walnut Street had been expanded twice by now. The back room that Pearl had planned during her first pregnancy, and a larger addition that incorporated a proper study for Raymond, and a room that served as overflow for the sewing work that Pearl sometimes brought home. It was a full house, a noisy house by any fair assessment, and they loved it in the way that people love things that have grown organically from what they actually needed rather than what they thought they were supposed to want. James Norris came from Missouri when Eleanor was born and stayed for 3 weeks, during which he was enormously useful with William, who adored his uncle with the immediate total devotion of small boys for people who are willing to get on the floor and play. James announced at the end of his visit that he had decided to move west. He had been considering it for a while, and was there room in Caldwell? There was room in Caldwell. Raymond helped him find it, and by the spring of 1887, James Norris was running a small freight operation out of town that did well enough to sustain him, and provided Raymond with the genuine pleasure of having his brother within reach. James remained unmarried for 2 more years after that, until he met a schoolteacher named Ruth who had come to Caldwell for the expanded school program, and then he was married very quickly, which surprised no one who knew James. The summers and winters stacked up in Caldwell in ways that were mostly good and occasionally difficult, because that is the nature of life, and Pearl and Raymond had enough experience of difficulty to know that it passed, and enough experience of goodness to be genuinely grateful for it. Raymond was re-elected sheriff 3 more times, and each time the election was less contested than the last, because the town had come to think of him as simply part of what Caldwell was, the steady one, the careful one, the one who told you the truth even when it was inconvenient, and who had been sitting in that office long enough to know every family and every alley and every pattern of behavior well enough to see trouble before it fully materialized. Pearl's shop celebrated its 5th anniversary with a small gathering that Clara organized, and that involved far more cake than any reasonable business anniversary required, which Pearl pointed out and everyone ignored. The shop by that point was the most successful women's business in Caldwell, a fact Pearl acknowledged with a satisfaction that was real and not false modest, because she had worked for it and she knew it. She and Raymond had their arguments, as all couples in real marriages do real arguments, not devastating ones, but the kind that come from two people with strong minds and genuine opinions living in close proximity. They argued about money management twice. Pearl won both times because she was better at it. They argued about how to handle a particular difficulty with a neighbor's encroaching fence line. Raymond turned out to be right, and she told him so, which he appreciated more than he showed. They argued once, memorably, about a stray dog that William had brought home, and that Pearl said they were absolutely not keeping, and Raymond sided with William, and the dog named Marshall by William, which Raymond privately found gratifying, lived with them for 11 years, and was mourned sincerely by the entire household when he finally went. They made up from their arguments with the specific thoroughness of people who had both been alone long enough to know that the making up was as important as the fighting, which is to say they always came back to each other, because there was nowhere else either of them wanted to be. William grew into a serious, quiet boy with his father's careful manner and his mother's tendency to form strong opinions, which combination proved both effective and occasionally exhausting in an adolescent. He had his father's gray eyes and Pearl's chestnut hair, and he was going to be tall already. At 10 years old, he was the second tallest boy in his class, which he accepted with the same equanimity with which he accepted most things. Alina was everything that balanced William's gravity, bright and easy laughing and intensely social, with Pearl's dark eyes and a quality of warmth that was entirely her own. She collected friends the way some children collect rocks, thoroughly and with genuine interest in each one, and the house on Walnut Street was frequently full of her companions in ways that Pearl found exhausting and delightful in equal proportion. The town of Caldwell changed around them, as towns do. The cattle trade declined further through the late 1880s, and some businesses closed and some people moved on. But the community that remained was a genuine one, people who had decided this was where they belonged, who had dug in and put up fences and planted trees that they expected to outlive them, which was the specific commitment that turned a cattle town into an actual home. Raymond's work changed with the town. The frontier rawness of the early 1880s had worn to something more settled, and his job was less about managing trail hands and more about the ordinary, complicated business of being a sheriff in a community that was trying to govern itself with some dignity. He was good at this too, because he had always understood that the job was fundamentally about people, and people did not change as much as their circumstances did. One evening in the autumn of 1889, when William was 5 and Alina was 3, and the household was in the particular noise and motion that characterized their evenings, Pearl and Raymond found themselves alone in the kitchen after the children had been put to bed, and Pearl poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Raymond had told her she was the woman he loved, years ago now, with the apple pie, and there was a long, good silence between them. "Do you remember the church steps?" Pearl said. "Yes," he said. "I've been thinking about that lately," she said, "about how certain I was that morning that everything was ruined." And he said. She looked at him across the table, at the gray eyes that had more lines around them now, at the silver that had fully claimed his temples and was making inroads elsewhere, at the face that she knew as well as she knew her own, better in some ways, because we see the people we love more clearly than we see ourselves. "I was wrong," she said. "Everything wasn't ruined. Everything had barely started." Raymond reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had on the bluff above the creek all those years ago, and held it in his warm, steady grip. "I know," he said. "You knew then too," she said. "On the steps, you sat down because you knew." "I sat down because someone should," he said. "And because," he paused, in the way he did when he was being precise, "because you were the kind of person worth sitting down for." Pearl turned her hand over and held his, and the geranium on the windowsill was still there. Not the same geranium, it had been replaced several times, but the window had always had one, because Pearl had decided when they moved in that it would, and she had kept that small, consistent promise to herself. And outside the window the Caldwell autumn night was clear and cold and full of stars, the way Kansas nights were, the sky enormous and unself-conscious about it. "Raymond," she said. "Pearl," he said. "I love you," she said. "I thought you should hear it plainly. I say it, I know I say it, but sometimes I think it's worth saying without anything attached to it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I love you, Pearl. I have loved you since the morning I sat down beside you, though I didn't know how to call it that yet. I have loved you through every Tuesday evening and every supper and every argument and every ordinary day we've had in this house, and I expect to love you through every ordinary day that's coming, for as long as I am living." It was, for Raymond, a long speech. Pearl knew that, and she knew what it cost him, and she valued it accordingly, which was immensely. She squeezed his hand and looked at him in the lamplight and thought about the church steps, and the rice in her veil, and the quiet man who had come around the corner and sat down beside her without saying a word, and had stayed in every way that mattered ever since. The years continued. William, at 17, announced that he wanted to study law, which surprised no one and delighted both of his parents, Pearl, because she saw in it the kind of serious commitment that matched her son's nature. Raymond, because he had spent enough years watching law work and fail and work again to know that good lawyers were as necessary to a community's health as good sheriffs. They began saving with the specific determination of people who know what they're working toward, and Raymond wrote to contacts in Topeka about what a young man would need to do to read law there, and Pearl took on extra commissions through the winter to add to the account, and William himself worked evenings at the general store with a steadiness and lack of complaint that Raymond found quietly moving. Eleanor, at 14, was her mother's clear inheritor in matters of the shop. She had been coming in after school for years, learning to cut and pin and stitch, and she had both the skill and, more importantly, the genuine love of the work that made the skill worth having. Pearl began, carefully and without pressure, to teach her the business side as well, how to manage accounts, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to handle a difficult customer with firmness and grace. "You'll run this shop someday," Pearl told her one afternoon, not as a command but as a statement of what seemed to be obviously true. Eleanor looked up from the seam she was pressing and said, with a matter-of-factness that made Pearl think of Raymond, "I know, I'm preparing." James and Ruth Norris had 2 children by now, a daughter named Catherine and a son named George, and the extended family of cousins had become one of the genuine joys of the Walnut Street household, which saw them regularly for Sunday dinners that had become a standing tradition. Ruth was a good match for James, patient and intelligent where he was enthusiastic and loud, and genuinely fond of both Pearl and Raymond in the specific way of people who admire what a marriage looks like when it's done right. Raymond turned 50 in the spring of 1901, and Pearl organized a dinner that was not, she insisted, a formal celebration, but was in fact a formal celebration, because Clara Withers had been involved in the planning and Clara's involvement made formality inevitable. The house on Walnut Street was full of people, Clara and Tom and their children, James and Ruth and their children, Mrs. Hanford, who was 73 and formidable as ever, William, home from Topeka where he was in his 2nd year of reading law, Eleanor with her closest friend, and various other people who had been part of the fabric of their life in Caldwell for years. Raymond stood in the middle of it, with his silver hair and his weathered face and his badge on his vest and his coffee in his hand, and Pearl watched him from across the room and saw him see her watching him, and across the heads of all the people who had gathered in this house that they had built together. He smiled at her, the real smile, the one he saved, the one that was hers. She smiled back, and Clara nudged her arm and said something sentimental that Pearl would later deny having agreed with, and William appeared beside her and handed her a fresh cup of tea, and Eleanor was laughing at something across the room, and the whole evening was warm and full, and everything that evening should be. Later, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet, Pearl and Raymond sat on the front porch in the night air with their coffee, looking at the street that had been their street for nearly 20 years. The town was quieter than it had been in the old cattle days, more settled, more itself, and the night sounds of it were peaceful. "Happy birthday," Pearl said. "Thank you," he said. 50 years, she said. "That seems like a lot of years." "From the inside it goes differently than you'd expect," he said. She looked at him. "Does it feel like enough?" she asked. "The life you've had." He turned and looked at her, and the gray eyes, which had always been the clearest thing about him, were unambiguous. "Pearl," he said, "it has been more than I ever knew to ask for." She reached over and took his hand on the porch rail, the same way she always took his hand, and held it, and they sat there in the Caldwell night under the Kansas stars that had been going on forever and would go on long after them. And there was nothing unfinished between them, nothing unresolved, only the plain and extraordinary fact of the life they had built together, which was real and complete and theirs. William passed his law examinations in 1903 and came home to Caldwell to practice, because he said he had grown up watching his father work for this town, and he intended to do the same in his own way. Raymond shook his hand and told him he was proud, which he said straightforwardly without any of the difficulty some men had with such things, because Pearl had helped him understand over many years that saying true things plainly was almost always the right choice. Alina took over Pearl Norris fine sewing formally in 1905, when Pearl was 47, and had decided that her hands deserved slightly less demanding work. She did not retire fully. She kept a hand in the design work and the accounts, and she came in on Tuesdays, which was a pattern that had always suited her. But the daily running of the shop passed to Alina with a completeness that satisfied them both. The sign above the door was repainted that year. Alina stood on the boardwalk looking up at it after the painter finished. The new sign said Pearl Norris Fine Sewing, and below it, in smaller letters, Alina Norris Proprietress. Pearl stood beside her daughter and looked at the sign and felt the weight of what she was seeing, her name up there, the name she had taken on the morning of her good wedding, the name she had built into something real, and below it her daughter's name continuing it. "Well," Alina said. "Well," Pearl said, "it looks exactly right." Raymond was with them, because he had taken the morning off to see the sign go up, which he almost never did, taking mornings off. He stood on Pearl's other side and looked up at the painted letters, and then he looked at Pearl, and the look said everything it had always said, that he saw her, clearly and fully, and that what he saw was good. The years that followed were the settled years, the years of grandchildren and slower mornings and longer evenings on the porch. William married a quiet, intelligent woman named Helen in 1906, and their first child, a boy they named Raymond Gerald, which was the kind of name that required the grandparents to pretend they weren't moved and failed entirely, arrived in 1908. Alina married considerably later, in her 30s, a man named Arthur Cole, who was a school teacher, and who turned out to be exactly the right sort of person for Alina, patient enough to keep up with her social life and smart enough to genuinely enjoy it. Raymond served as sheriff of Caldwell until 1910, when he was 59 years old, and his deputy, a capable young man named Sanders who had been with him for 6 years, was ready to take the position. Raymond left it without drama or ceremony, handing over the badge in the same plain, uncomplicated way he had always done things. He was not, as it turned out, a man who struggled with retirement. He had always been capable of stillness, and the stillness of his later years was simply given more time to be itself. He spent mornings in the garden, a genuine garden, not just a yard, with vegetables and Pearl's persistent geraniums relocated to proper beds, and afternoons occasionally helping William with research for cases, which he was good at because 40 years of paying attention to people turned out to be useful legal preparation. He read widely. He wrote in his journals, which by 1910 filled an entire shelf, and which Pearl had still never read, and which he told her once in a quiet late-night conversation he had intended to leave to her when he died, so that she could know the inside of all his thinking about their life together. She had told him she would read every word. She had meant it. The morning Pearl found the garnet ring that she had worn for nearly 30 years, sitting on the kitchen table in a small dish where she had left it the night before after her hands had swollen slightly with the cold. She put it on again and looked at it in the east kitchen light, and thought about the moment Raymond had held it out to her in the sewing room, careful and deliberate and entirely certain. She was 50 years old now. The dark hair had silver in it, the way his had gone silver at the temples all those years ago, and her hands were skilled and work-worn and beautiful in the way that hands become beautiful when they have made things for decades. The garnet glowed on her finger like the first time. Raymond came into the kitchen and put the coffee on, and she watched him move through the room with the ease of a man who knew where everything was in his own kitchen, and when he turned and saw her looking at him, he raised his eyebrows in the question he had always asked without words, "Are you all right? What is it? What are you thinking?" "I was just remembering the church steps," she said. He came and sat across from her at the table and looked at her. "What about them? How certain I was that everything was finished," she said, "and how wrong I was." "You've said this before," he said. "It keeps being worth saying," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand, the hand with the garnet ring, with his, the same way he had always done, steady and sure and entirely there. "Pearl," he said. "Raymond," she said. "Everything is not finished," he said. "Everything is, I think, still very much in progress." She looked at his hand covering hers, at the garnet glowing underneath his fingers, at the east morning light coming through the kitchen window where the geranium bloomed red on the sill, and she felt the whole weight of their life together. The church steps and the Tuesday evenings and the first dinner at the prairie table and the ring and the wedding in May and the baby in April and the arguments and the making up and the shop and the house and the children and the grandchildren, and all the ordinary days stacked up like something magnificent. And she squeezed his hand and looked at him across the breakfast table in their Caldwell kitchen in the morning light, and she said, "Yes. You're right, it is." And it was. The last full day that Raymond and Pearl spent on their porch together was a September evening in 1920, when the Kansas sky was doing what it always did in September, going enormous and dramatic, stacking clouds in colors that were almost improper in their vividness, purple and orange and the specific deep gold of late prairie afternoons. They sat in their chairs with their coffee and watched the sky together, and William came by with his son Raymond Gerald, who was 12 now and serious and curious in ways that made both grandparents smile, and he ran through the yard chasing something while the adults sat on the porch and talked about ordinary things. Raymond held Pearl's hand on the arm of his chair. The garnet ring was on her finger. The geranium was in the window behind them. The house on Walnut Street was their house, fully and completely in every possible sense. "I'm glad I sat down," Raymond said at one point in the evening without context. Pearl looked at him. She did not need the context. "I'm glad you did too," she said. The sky went on doing what it was doing, magnificent and indifferent and entirely beautiful, and the 12-year-old in the yard caught whatever he was chasing and held it up triumphantly, and William laughed from the porch steps, and the evening came in slow and warm over Caldwell, and Pearl Norris sat beside the man who had sat beside her and held his hand in the fading light, and there was nothing incomplete about any of it. Everything that had needed to be built had been built. Everything that had needed to be said had been said. Everything that had begun on a church step in the summer of 1882, with a man who had simply decided to sit down beside someone who needed company, had grown into a life that was full and real and entirely theirs. It was, by any honest measure, more than enough. It was, by the measure of people who had lived it, everything.